The steel bolt slammed home. No escape. Professor Sterling locked us in, his voice raw with vengeance. One of you destroyed my life. The screen lit up with Sarah's bank records, proof of her betrayal. My fingers clenched around the confiscated phone in my pocket. If he finds it, I'm next. The knife glinted in Jennifer's hand, not for him, but for Sarah. You should have stayed loyal. The room held its breath. Too late. The brass key ground against the lock, a heavy metallic click echoing through the tiered auditorium of room 302. Robert Sterling withdrew the metal, the cold ridges biting into his palm before he slid it into his tweed pocket. Silence descended, thick and smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. 20 elite students, the children of the coast's most powerful families, sat frozen in their bolted-down desks. Their pens hovered like tiny plastic spears over notebooks that would remain empty today. Robert stepped toward the lectern. His leather soles creaked on the polished wood, the only sound in the cavernous room. He ignored the stack of approved textbooks sitting on the edge of the desk, the glossy volumes on ethics and corporate law that were as hollow as the people who wrote them. Instead, he hoisted a heavy cardboard box onto the surface. The thud resonated in the chests of those in the front row, a dull, physical punctuation mark to the end of their comfort. The syllabus is a lie, Robert said. His voice remained low, raspy from years of lecturing, devoid of the usual academic drone. He began to count the ceiling tiles, a habit that grounded him. 1, 2, 3, 14. The room was a perfect rectangle, a controlled environment. He gripped a stack of papers, the edges sharp and white against his weathered skin. He moved down the center aisle, thrusting thick dossiers into trembling hands. The paper felt heavy, dense with the weight of redacted names and blurred bank statements. These weren't assignments. They were autopsies. They detailed a 2014 conspiracy that had buried the truth of a chemical spill, and with it, Robert's Ivy League career and his wife's life. May read page 12, Robert commanded, his eyes tracking the flicker of the fluorescent lights. Follow the money until your hands get dirty. You'll find your family crests at the bottom of the ledger. Sarah Johnson, sitting in the second row, adjusted her diamond necklace. The gold chain hissed against her silk blouse. She was the daughter of the dean, the crown jewel of this institution, and today she was the primary variable in Robert's equation. Robert returned to the front of the room and tapped a sequence into his laptop. A projector hummed to life, casting a harsh blue glow against the scrubbed clean chalkboard. Let's look at the digital trail, Robert said, his finger hovering over the enter key. He decided to play his strongest card early. He projected Sarah Johnson's private bank statements directly onto the screen, the numbers sprawling across the board in giant, unforgiving font. He showed the encrypted emails, the wire transfers, the trail of breadcrumbs that proved Sarah had used her father's influence and a series of offshore accounts to bribe university administrators. She hadn't just cheated on an exam. She had fabricated misconduct charges against Robert 3 years ago to ensure he stayed silent about the 2014 cover-up. Sarah's face drained of color, her skin turning the shade of bone under the projector's glare. She leaned forward, her high-fashion wardrobe acting like armor that had suddenly developed a crack. "This is private," she hissed, her voice cracking. "You can't show this. It's illegal." "Illegal is a relative term in this building, Sarah," Robert replied, his voice a cold, steady stream. "I'm simply showing your work. You wanted me gone because I knew about the Johnson family's involvement in the Delaware Basin. You paid $50,000 to a clerk to put child pornography on my office computer. You didn't just want me fired, you wanted me erased. The room erupted in a low murmur. Students who had spent years sucking up to Sarah for internships now recoiled. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling with the screen. She needed to call her father. She needed the dean to make this disappear. She tapped the screen with a manic intensity, her breathing coming in shallow, jagged hitches. Robert watched her. He felt a surge of confidence. This was the moment he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his head. The logic was sound. By exposing her crimes in front of witnesses, he would force a confession. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and pleading. She looked small. She looked defeated. Robert felt the tension in his jaw relax for the first time in a decade. He had her. The truth was finally out, and the weight of the lie was shifting from his shoulders to hers. He leaned back against the mahogany desk, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. The signal is dead, Sarah. Don't bother. Sarah's thumb continued to swipe. Then she stopped. She didn't look at the phone. She looked at the door. Then she looked back at Robert, and the terror in her eyes suddenly vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory gleam. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She slowly stood up, smoothing her skirt with a deliberate, mechanical motion. "You're right, Robert," she said, her voice regaining its polished, upper-class edge. "The signal is dead, which means nobody outside knows what you're doing. But everyone inside, they see a man who has finally snapped. They see a disgraced professor holding 20 students hostage." Robert frowned. A cold prickle danced across his skin. Something was wrong. He looked at the projector. The bank statements were still there, but Sarah wasn't looking at them. She was looking at the small red light of the security camera in the corner of the room. "I didn't just bribe that clerk to frame you, Robert," Sarah whispered, leaning over her desk. "I paid him to keep a back door open into the campus security system. I knew you were coming for me. I've been waiting for you to lose your mind." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, pre-written statement. "I already filed a report this morning with the campus police, claiming you were stalking me. I told them you threatened to kill us all if I didn't give you money. This exposure, it's just the evidence of your mental breakdown. You didn't trap me, Robert. You just walked into a cage and locked the door behind you." Robert lunged for his laptop, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He tried to close the file, but the screen froze. A red box appeared in the center of the display. Access denied. He had intended to use her crimes to buy his freedom. Instead, he had provided the perfect theater for her to paint him as a terrorist. He wasn't the whistleblower anymore. He was the gunman. The realization hit him like a physical blow, making his knees weak. He had lost the high ground before the first hour was over. "Sit down," David Miller roared, the sound of his voice shattering the stunned silence. David, a broad-shouldered man whose neck was thick enough to strain the collar of his polo shirt, stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. He didn't look at the documents on the wall. He only saw the man standing between him and the exit. David lunged. He moved with the practiced explosiveness of a linebacker, his heavy boots thudding on the wood. Robert barely had time to react. He reached onto the lectern, his fingers closing around a heavy brass paperweight shaped like a lion. As David swung a massive fist, Robert ducked and drove the brass into David's ribs. The sound was sickening, a dull thwack of metal against bone. David gasped, the air leaving his lungs in a wheeze, and he stumbled back, crashing into the chalkboard. Dust billowed up, coating his dark hair in a ghostly white. Robert didn't give him a chance to recover. He stepped in close, pressing the edge of the brass lion against David's throat, pinning him to the slate. 13, 14, 15, Robert whispered, the numbers hissing through his teeth. One more move, and I stop being a teacher. Do you understand? David's eyes were wide, the pupils blown. He nodded frantically, the sharp crack of his knuckles echoing in the silence as he gripped the edge of a desk. Robert stepped back, his chest heaving. He reached into the cardboard box and pulled out a heavy, lead-lined bag. "Phones," Robert commanded, his voice shaking with a cocktail of adrenaline and rage. "In the bag. Now. If I see a screen glow, I will assume you are calling for a strike team, and I will act accordingly." One by one, the students shuffled forward. The sound of plastic hitting the bottom of the lead-lined bag was rhythmic, like stones being dropped into a well. Clunk, clunk, clunk. Each sound represented a thread to the outside world being severed. Robert felt the air in the room grow heavier, the smell of sweat and fear beginning to overpower the floor wax. "You think this helps you?" Sarah asked, her voice a low hum as she dropped her gold-cased iPhone into the bag. She didn't look afraid anymore. She looked like she was observing a laboratory animal. "You're just adding kidnapping to the list of charges." "I'm adding time," Robert replied. Suddenly, a flash of silver caught the corner of Robert's eye. Jennifer Brown, Sarah's shadow, the girl who spent every lecture whispering in Sarah's ear and fetching her lattes, moved. But she didn't move toward the bag. She moved toward Sarah. Jennifer reached into the pocket of her oversized sweater and pulled out a small pocket knife. The blade flicked open with a sharp snick. Before Sarah could react, Jennifer had the serrated edge pressed against Sarah's silk-covered throat. "Don't move, Sarah," Jennifer whispered. Her voice was no longer mousy or apologetic. It was flat, hard, and terrifyingly calm. "I've spent 3 years cleaning up your messes. I'm not going to let you talk your way out of this one." The room gasped. David Miller started to move, but Jennifer pressed the blade deeper, a tiny bead of crimson appearing on Sarah's pale skin. "Stay back, David," Robert said, though he was as surprised as the students. He looked at Jennifer. She looked back at him, a subtle nod confirming the secret they had shared for months. "She's been my eyes, Sarah," Robert told the room, his voice regaining its authority. "Jennifer didn't just do your homework. She recorded your conversations. She copied your files. She's the one who gave me the bank statements. You thought she was your dog, but she's been the one holding the leash." Jennifer's hand was steady. She rubbed her worry stone with her free hand, the sh-sh sound of stone on fabric, a chilling accompaniment to the standoff. "The dean's daughter," Jennifer mocked, her eyes burning. "You're not a leader, Sarah. You're just a virus with a trust fund." The betrayal hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Robert checked his watch. The second act was beginning. "Listen to the clock," Robert said, pointing to the wall. "In exactly 38 minutes, campus security, a man named Christopher Scott, will perform a routine sweep of this hallway. He will whistle 3 notes of a pop song. He will rattle the handle of this door. If he hears a scream, if he sees a drop of blood under the crack, he will call the real police. And then, the chance for anyone in this room to walk away with their future intact vanishes." He turned to the back of the room, looking at Marcus Reed. Marcus was picking at his cuticles, his fingers raw and bleeding. He was the son of a family that had lost everything in the 2008 crash, a man who had scraped and clawed to get into this room. "Marcus," Robert said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial level, "let's talk about the financial aid fund." Let's talk about the $20,000 that went missing from the Pell Grant allocations last semester. The money that was supposed to go to students who couldn't afford their books. Marcus froze. The blue light of his bank balance reflected in his eyes as he clutched his phone. The only one Robert hadn't confiscated yet. "You stole from your own," Robert said. "You saw the Johnson family taking whatever they wanted, and you thought, why not me? You used the same backdoor Sarah created to reroute the funds." The other students turned. The collective anger in the room shifted. It was no longer just about Robert versus the class. It was about the rot inside the group. "You son of a bitch," a girl in the back row yelled. "That was my tuition." The room dissolved into chaos. Accusations flew like shrapnel. Robert watched, his jaw tight. He needed them broken. He needed the social contract of the elite to crumble until only the raw, ugly truth remained. A low, rhythmic hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. It was a high-frequency sound, right at the edge of human hearing, designed to cause nausea and irritability. Robert had installed the emitters in the vents an hour before the class began. He saw Amanda Wilson cover her ears, her eyes welling with tears. She began to rock back and forth, apologizing to her desk as she bumped against it. "Make it stop," she shrieked. "Please, Professor, make the noise stop." "The noise is the sound of your own conscience, Amanda." Robert lied, his voice projecting over the hum. "It will stop when the truth is signed and witnessed." David Miller had seen enough. He looked at the other two male students, large, athletic men, who felt the same primal urge to reclaim their dominance. They exchanged a look. They didn't need words. They grabbed the heavy seminar table at the front of the room, their muscles straining against their polo shirts. "On three," David roared. "1, 2, 3, they charged. The table was a massive slab of oak and steel, a battering ram aimed at the reinforced door. They ignored Robert. They ignored the knife at Sarah's throat. They only wanted out. Robert didn't move to stop them. He simply reached into his pocket and pressed a small remote. A sharp, blue arc of electricity jumped from the door frame to the metal legs of the table. A crackling sound, like a whip snapping, filled the room. David and the other two men were thrown backward as if hit by an invisible truck. They hit the floor hard, their limbs twitching in temporary muscular paralysis. The smell of ozone and scorched hair filled the air. "Magnetic locks," Robert explained calmly, stepping over David's prone body. "The frame is energized. I wouldn't try that again. Your heart might not handle the second surge." In the corner, Chloe Miller, no relation to David, but twice as sharp, began to laugh. It was a cold, brittle sound. She flicked her Zippo lighter open and shut. Clink, zip, clink, zip. "You're so proud of your evidence, Robert," Chloe said, standing up. She looked at the dossiers scattered across the desks. "The emails, the forgeries. You think you've unmasked us?" She walked to the front of the room, her bobbed hair swinging. She picked up the dossier Robert had used to implicate her in a grade tampering scandal. "I made these," Chloe said, her voice dripping with contempt. "I planted these in the dean's digital archive months ago. I didn't do it to hide my grades. I did it to frame the girl who took my spot on the law review. I wanted the university to find them. I wanted them to investigate me so I could lead them right to her." Robert felt the room tilt. "What?" "You're a dinosaur, Robert," Chloe said, flicking the lighter. "You think facts are solid things. In this world, facts are just clay. I manipulated your investigation from the start. Half the evidence in that box is stuff I fed to Jennifer, knowing she'd take it to you." Robert looked at Jennifer. The girl with the knife didn't look away, but her hand trembled. Is this true? Robert asked, his voice a ragged whisper. I thought it was real, Robert, Jennifer stammered. She said she found them in the dean's private cloud. Robert realized his grand calculation was riddled with errors. He wasn't the master of the variables. He was just another piece on the board being moved by students who had been born into deception. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't care about the law anymore. He didn't care about the lesson. It doesn't matter, Robert growled, his voice vibrating with a dark energy. The door is still locked. The hum is still playing. And we haven't talked about the boy in the back yet. He turned his focus to Thomas Wright. Thomas was huddled in the corner, his hoodie pulled low, his eyes fixed on the floor. He was humming a low, dissonant funeral dirge, a sound that made the hair on Robert's neck stand up. Thomas, Robert said, his voice like a scalpel. Look at me. Thomas didn't move. I have a photograph, Robert said, pulling a grainy black and white image from his pocket. It's from the night of the spill in 2014. It shows a man standing by the waste valves, holding a clipboard. That man is your father, Thomas. He wasn't just a witness. He was the one who signed the order to dump the chemicals into the local water table. The chemicals that gave my wife the cancer that killed her. The room went silent. Even the hum seemed to fade. Your father was a coward, Robert said, stepping toward Thomas. He let the company blame a junior engineer. He watched a man go to prison for his mistake. And you've spent your whole life hiding in his shadow, enjoying the tuition paid for by that blood money. Thomas finally looked up. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. I didn't know, he whispered. He told me he was a hero. A lie is just a truth that hasn't happened yet. Chloe quoted from the side, her lighter clicking. Sarah Johnson saw her opening. She saw the group's attention shift to Thomas, the new pariah. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on a loose ventilation grate near the ceiling. It was high up, but if she climbed on a desk, she could reach it. She began to move, her heels silent on the floorboards as the students began to surround Thomas. She felt a surge of hope. This was it. Sterling was distracted by his vendetta. David was still groaning on the floor. Jennifer was watching Thomas with a look of disgusted fascination. Sarah stepped onto a chair, then onto the top of a desk. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the grate. It was loose, just as she'd hoped. She could pull herself up, crawl through the ducts, and find the main junction. She'd be out in minutes. She could visualize it. The cool air of the hallway, the security guards, the sweet, clean smell of her father's office. She felt her shoulders drop, her breathing slowing for the first time since the bolt had slid home. She gripped the edges of the vent and pulled. The grate came away with a satisfying metallic clack. She peered into the dark rectangular hole, ready to haul herself into freedom. Go ahead, Sarah. Robert's voice drifted up from the podium. He hadn't even turned around. The view is lovely this time of year. Sarah paused, her fingers digging into the metal. She looked into the dark void of the duct. Then she saw it. A thick, yellowish-white mass filled the entire space. It looked like hardened sea foam, dense and impenetrable. Industrial expanding foam, Robert said, finally turning to look at her. I spent 3 nights in the crawl spaces. Every vent, every pipe, every square inch of the ceiling is packed solid. You could spend a week with a saw and not make it 10 feet. Sarah's fingers slipped. She tumbled off the desk, landing hard on the floor. The silk of her blouse tore, and her diamond necklace caught on the edge of the wood, snapping the chain. The diamonds scattered across the floor like frozen tears. "You're not going anywhere," Robert said. The room was a pressure cooker. The students, driven to a feral state by the ultrasonic hum and the revelation of Thomas's lineage, began to close in on the boy. They needed someone to pay. They couldn't hit Robert. He had the electricity and the brass lion. But Thomas was soft. Thomas was guilty by association. "Tell us the truth," Marcus Reed screamed, grabbing Thomas by the hoodie. "Where's the rest of the money? How much did your father get for killing that woman?" "I don't know," Thomas sobbed, his voice breaking. "Please, I was 10 years old." They didn't listen. A hand reached out and slapped him. Then another. They were a mob now, their elite education stripped away to reveal the prehistoric cruelty underneath. Robert watched for a moment, a dark satisfaction blooming in his chest. This was the justice he had craved. But then he saw the look in Thomas's eyes, the same look his father had the day they took him away. The look of an innocent man being crushed by a narrative he couldn't control. "Stop!" Robert roared, lunging into the fray. He grabbed Marcus Reed, pulling him away from Thomas. But Marcus was past the point of reason. He swung a laptop cord like a garrote, looping it around Robert's neck. Robert felt the wire bite into his throat, cutting off his air. The world began to dim, the ceiling tiles blurring into a gray haze. He clawed at the cord, his fingers slick with sweat. He could hear the blood thundering in his ears, a rhythmic, frantic pulse. Thump, 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 thump. He drove his elbow back, catching Marcus in the solar plexus. The cord slackened just enough for Robert to twist away. He threw Marcus against the lectern, the heavy wood groaning under the impact. Robert slumped against the chalkboard, gasping for air. He reached for his laptop, his fingers trembling. He needed to check the feed. He needed to see if his star witness, the former security chief who had promised to testify, was ready. He opened the encrypted messenger. A single message sat in the inbox, sent 3 minutes ago. Subject, Witness 01. Status, deceased. Location, Dormitory 4B. Cause, apparent overdose. The words hit Robert harder than the electricity had hit David. His witness was gone. The only man who could verify the dossiers, the only man who could turn this kidnapping into a legal whistleblowing event, was dead. Robert looked at the students. He looked at the locked door. He realized with a sickening clarity that he was no longer a revolutionary. He was just a man in a room with 20 people who hated him, holding a pile of evidence that a clever girl had already admitted to forging. He was a kidnapper. He was a felon. And the dean was still in his office, sipping tea, watching the clock. The pounding began then. Heavy, rhythmic blows against the oak door. "Campus police, open up!" The 3-note whistle of Christopher Scott was gone, replaced by the harsh, metallic commands of men with badges and guns. Robert looked at the laptop. He saw a progress bar on the screen. Remote wipe in progress, 15%, 22%. The dean's hackers were inside his system. They were erasing the bank statements, the emails, the photos of the waste valves. In 60 seconds, Robert would be standing in a room with nothing but a brass lion and a broken dream. He acted on instinct. He didn't try to stop the wipe. Instead, he grabbed a physical cable from his bag, a legacy connector he'd salvaged from the university's basement years ago. He jammed it into the wall jack, bypassing the wireless network entirely. "What are you doing?" Sarah screamed, her voice shrill with panic. "The police are here! Give up!" "I'm changing the channel," Robert said. He didn't send the data to a server. He sent the raw video feed from the classroom's internal camera, the one Sarah thought she was using to frame him. and he patched it directly into the campus security monitors, the local news stations, and the university's public jumbotron in the quad. He didn't show the dossiers. He showed the students. He showed David Miller trying to kill him with a table. He showed Marcus Reed trying to strangle him. He showed Jennifer Brown holding a knife to a girl's throat. He showed the elite of the next generation behaving like animals in a cage. Then, he turned the camera toward himself. "My name is Robert Sterling," he said, his voice echoing through the speakers in the quad outside. "I am a kidnapper. I am a criminal. But look at the people I am holding. Look at the faces of the families who run this city. This isn't a classroom. It's a mirror." He turned to Sarah. "Call your father, Sarah. Tell him to watch the screen. Tell him I know Thomas is innocent. I know he's just a scapegoat, just like my father was. The real signatures aren't on page 12. They're on the birth certificates of every person in this room." The door splintered. The steel bolt groaned and finally gave way. Robert didn't run. He didn't fight. He walked back to his desk and sat down. He straightened his glasses with his middle finger. 1, 2, 3. The police swarmed the room, a sea of black tactical gear and blinding flashlights. They tackled Marcus. They disarmed Jennifer. They pulled Sarah and Thomas to safety. A high-ranking officer stepped toward Robert, a pair of heavy steel handcuffs glinting in the light. "Robert Sterling, you're under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and domestic terrorism." Robert held out his wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin, a familiar, grounding sensation. He looked past the officer, straight into the lens of the camera. In his office across campus, Dean Richard Johnson sat frozen. He watched the screen as his daughter was led out in tears, her reputation shattered by the footage of her bribery and her cowardice. He saw the world watching the rot he had spent 20 years hiding. Robert Sterling smiled. It was a grim, tired expression. But it was real. He was going to prison. He would never teach again. He would likely die behind bars. But as he was led out of room 302, he felt the weight of the last 10 years lift. The lie was dead. The monsters were unmasked. And for the first time since 2014, the numbers finally added up.